We continue Sylla from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Sylla, by this time thinking that the reputation of his arms abroad was sufficient to entitle him to a part in the civil administration, betook himself immediately from the camp to the assembly and offered himself as a candidate for proctorship, but failed. The fault of this disappointment he wholly ascribes to the populace, who, knowing his intimacy with King Bacchus, and for that reason expecting that if he was made aedile before his proctorship, he would then show them magnificent hunting shows and combats between Libyan wild beasts, choose other proctors, on purpose to force him into the aedileship. The vanity of this pretext is sufficiently disproved by matter of fact. For the following, partly by flatteries to the people and partly by money, he got himself elected proctor. Accordingly, once while he was in office, on his angrily telling Caesar that he should make use of his authority against him, Caesar answered him with a smile, "You do well to call it your own, as you bought it." At the end of his proctorship, he sent over into Cappadocia under pretense of re-establishing Ariobarzanes in his kingdom, but in reality to keep in check the restless movements of Mithridates. Now, sometimes, there's you could say ATES, but in Greek sometimes you have the sometimes you don't really have that. It's hard to tell without the Greek characters how the Greeks would have said this, and of course they're talking of Italy too, so who's gradually procuring himself as vast a new acquired power and dominion as was that of his ancient inheritance. He carried over with him no great forces of his own, but making use of the cheerful aid of the Confederates, succeeded with considerable slaughter of the Cappadocians and yet greater of the Armenian succors in expelling Gordius and establishing Ariobarzanes as king. During his stay on the banks of the Euphrates, there came to him Orobazes, a Parthian, ambassador from King Arsacchus. As yet, there having been no correspondence between the two nations. And, of course, Latin wasn't pronounced the same as Italian, or whatever other way we might pronounce the same things, Cappadocia and the Euphrates and, that sort of thing. And Libya versus Liban. And this also we may lay to the account of Sylla's felicity, that he should be the first Roman to whom the Parthians made address for alliance and friendship, at the time of which reception the story is that having ordered 3 chairs of state to be placed, one for Ariobarzanes, one for Orobazes, and a third for himself, he placed himself in the middle, and so gave audience. For this the king of Parthia afterwards put Orobazes to death. Some people commended Sylla for his lofty carriage towards the barbarians. They just mean they didn't speak their language. Others, again, accused him of arrogance and unseasonable display. It is reported that a certain Chaldean of Orobazes' retinue, Sylla wistfully in the face, and observing carefully the motions of his mind and body, and forming a judgment of his nature according to the rules of his art, said that it was impossible for him not to become the greatest of men. It was rather a wonder how he could even then abstain from being head of all. At his return, Censorinus impeached him of extortion, for having exacted a vast sum of money from a well-affected and associate kingdom. However, Censorinus did not appear at the trial, but dropped his accusation. His quarrel, meantime, with Marius began to break out afresh, receiving new material from the ambition of Bacchus, who, to please the people of Rome and gratify Sylla, set up in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus images bearing trophies and a representation in gold of the surrender of Jugurtha to Sylla, when Marius, in great anger, attempted to pull them down, and others aided Sylla. The whole city would have been in tumult and commotion with this dispute had not the social war, which had long lain smoldering, blazed forth at last, and for the present put an end to the quarrel. In the course of this war, which had many great changes of fortune, and which, more than any, afflicted the Romans, and indeed endangered the very being of the Commonwealth, Marius was not able to signalize his valor in any action, but left behind him a clear proof that warlike excellence requires a strong and still vigorous body. Sylla, on the other hand, by his many achievements, gained himself with his fellow citizens the name of a great commander, while his friends thought him the greatest of all commanders, and his enemies called him the most fortunate. Nor did this make the same sort of impression on him as it made on Timotheus, the son of Conon the Athenian, who, when his adversaries ascribed his successes to his good luck, and had a painting made representing him asleep, and fortune by his side, casting your nets over the cities, was rough and violent in his indignation at those who did it, as if by attributing all to fortune, they had robbed him of his just honors. No, your destiny is certainly your character always factors into that, right? And said to the people on one occasion, at his return from war, "In this, ye men of Athens, fortune had no part." Well, it's not the set that, it's not that you have total control. It's not that you have no control, a piece, a boyish petulance, which the deity, we are told, played back upon Timotheus, who from that time was never able to achieve anything that was great, but proving altogether unfortunate in his attempts, and falling into discredit with the people, was at last banished from the city. Sylla, on the contrary, not only accepted with pleasure the credit of such divine felicities and favors, but joining himself in extolling and glorifying what was done, gave the honor of all to fortune, whether it were out of boastfulness or a real feeling of divine agency. He remarks in his memoirs that of all his well-advised actions, none proved so lucky in the execution as what he had bodily enterprised, not by calculation, but upon the moment. And in the character which he gives of himself, that he was born for fortune rather than war, he seems to give fortune a higher place than merit, and, in short, makes himself entirely the creature of a superior power, accounting even his concord with Metellus his equal in office, and his connection by marriage a piece of preternatural felicity, for, expecting to have met in him a most troublesome, he found him a most accommodating colleague. Moreover, in the memoirs which he dedicated to Lucullus, he admonished him to esteem nothing more trustworthy than what the divine powers advised him by night, and when he was leaving in the city with an army to fight in the social war, he relates that the earth near the Laverna opened, and a quantity of fire came rushing out of it, and shooting up with a bright flame into the heavens. The soothsayers upon this foretold that a person of great qualities and of a rare and singular aspect should take the government in hand, and quiet the present troubles of the city. Sylla affirms he was the man, for his golden head of hair made him an extraordinary-looking man, nor had he any shame, after the great actions he had done in testifying to his own great qualities, and thus much of his opinion as to divine agency. In general, he would seem to have been of a very irregular character, full of inconsistencies with himself, much given to rapine, to prodigality, yet more in promoting or disgracing whom he placed alike unaccountable, cringing to those he stood in need of, and domineering over those who stood in need of him, so that it was hard to tell whether his nature had more in it of pride or of servility. As to his unequal distribution of punishments, as, for example, that upon slight grounds he would put to the torture, and again would bear patiently with the greatest wrongs, would readily forgive and be reconciled after the most heinous acts of enmity, and yet would visit small and inconsiderable offences with death and confiscation of goods, one might judge that in himself he was really of a violent and revengeful nature, which, however, he could qualify upon reflection for his interest. In this very social war, when the soldiers with stones and clubs had killed an officer of praetorian rank, his own lieutenant, Albinus by name, he passed by this flagrant crime without any inquiry, giving it out, moreover, in a boast that the soldiers would behave all the better now, to make amends by some special bravery for their breach of discipline. He took no notice of the clamors of those that cried for justice, but designing already to supplant Marius, now he saw the social war near its end, he made much of his army, in hopes to get himself declared general of the forces against Mithridates. At his return to Rome, he was chosen consul with Quintus Pompeius in the 50th year of his age, and made a most distinguished marriage with Caecilia, daughter of Metellus, the chief priest. The common people made a variety of verses in ridicule of the marriage, and many of the nobility also were disgusted at it, esteeming it, as Livy writes, unworthy of this connection, whom before they thought worthy of a consulship. This was not his only wife, for first in his younger days he was married to Ilia, by whom he had a daughter. After her to Alia, and thirdly to Cloelia, whom he dismissed as barren, but honorably, and with professions of respect, adding moreover presents. But the match between him and Metella, falling out a few days later, occasioned suspicions that he had great deference, so much that the people, when anxious for the recall of the exiles of Marius's party, upon his refusal, entreated the intercession of Metella, and the Athenians, it is thought, had harder measure of the capture of their town, because they used insulting language to Metella in their jests from the walls during the siege, but of this hereafter. At present, esteeming the consulship but a small matter in comparison of the things to come, he was impatiently carried away with the thought, in thought, to the Mithridatic war. Here he was withstood by Marius, who, out of mad affection of glory and thirst for distinction, those never-dying passions, though he were now unwieldy in body, and had given up service on account of his age during the late campaigns, still coveted after command in a distant war beyond the seas, and whilst Sylla was departed from the camp to order the rest of his affairs there, he sat brooding at home, and at last hatched that execrable sedition, which wrought Rome more mischief than all her enemies together had done, as was indeed foreshown by the gods. So, what the soothsayers, I guess, said that this is the message, right? For a flame broke forth of its own accord from under the staves at the ensigns, and was with difficulty extinguished. 3 ravens brought their young into the open road and ate them, carrying the relics into the nest again. Mice having gnawed the consecrated gold in one of the temples, the keepers caught one of them, a female in a trap, and she, bringing forth 5 young ones in the very trap, devoured 3 of them. But what was greatest of all, in a calm and clear sky, there was heard the sound of a trumpet, with such a loud and dismal blast as struck terror and amazement into the hearts of the people. The Etruscan sages affirmed that this prodigy betokened the mutation of the age, and a general revolution in the world, for according to them there are in all 8 ages, differing one from another in the lives and the characters of men, and to each of these God has allotted a certain measure of time determined by the circuit of the great year, and when one age is run out, at the approach of another, there appears some wonderful sign from earth or heaven, such as makes it manifest at once to those who have made it their business to study such things, that there has succeeded in the world a new race of men, differing in customs and institutes of life, and more or less regarded by the entities than the preceding. Among the other changes that happen, as they say, at the turn of ages, the art of divination also, at one time, rises in esteem, and is more successful in its predictions, clearer and surer tokens being sent from God, and then again, in another generation, declines as low, becoming mere guesswork for the most part, and discerning future events by dim and uncertain intimations. Now, it seems that even at its base, without additional speculation thrown on, that it's always a mixed bag. The oracle interpretation, if you're going to take it somewhere other than psychological, or you're brainstorming in a spiritual way, really. This was the mythology of the wisest of the Tuscan sages, who were thought to possess a knowledge beyond other men. Whilst the Senate sat in consultation with the soothsayers concerning these prodigies in the temple of Bellana, a sparrow came flying in before them all, with a grasshopper in its mouth, and letting fall one part of it, flew away with the remainder. The diviners foreboded commotions and dissensions between the great landed proprietors and the common city populace, the latter, like the grasshopper, being loud and talkative, while the sparrow might represent the dwellers in the field. Marius had taken into alliance Sulpicius, the tribune, a man second to none in any villainies, so that it was less the question what others he surpassed, but rather in what respects he most surpassed himself. In wickedness he was cruel, bold, rapacious, and in all these points utterly shameless and unscrupulous, not hesitating to offer Roman citizenship by public sale to freed slaves and aliens, and to count out the price on public money tables in the forum. And we find nowadays that sort of thing being done in my country is that rather than make sure that things are good at home, we're like, well, let's support the criminals and let's support the foreigners first. But then again, a lot of this supporting the foreigners is not actually supporting the foreigners. It's actually making things good for corporate heads and whatever. And a lot of problems exist with immigration like never before. So there's a difference between being a globalist and being somebody who's actually trying to be good for the world. He maintained 3,000 swordsmen, and had always about him a company of young men of the equestrian class, ready for all occasions, whom he styled as anti-senate. He styled as anti-senate, having had a law enacted that no senator should contract a debt of above 2,000 drachmas. He himself, after death, was found indebted 3 millions. This was the man whom Marius let in upon the commonwealth, and who, confounding all things by force and the sword, made several ordinances of dangerous consequences, and amongst the rest, one giving Marius the conduct of a Mithridatic war. Upon this, the consuls proclaimed a public cessation of business, but as they were holding an assembly near the temple of Castor and Pollux, he let loose the rabble upon them, and, among many others, slew the consul, Pompeius's young son, in the forum. Pompeius himself hardly escaping in the crowd, Sylla being closely pursued into the house of Marius, was forced to come forth and dissolve the cessation, and for his doing this, Sulpicius, having disposed Pompeius, allowed Sylla to continue his consulship, only transferring the Mithridatic expedition to Marius. There were immediately dispatched to Nola tribunes to receive the army and bring it to Marius, but Sylla, having got first to the camp, and the soldiers, upon hearing the news, having stoned the tribunes, Marius, in requital, proceeded to put the friends of Sylla into the city to the sword, and rifled their goods. Every kind of removal and flight went on, some hastening to the camp, from the camp to the city, and others from the city to the camp. The Senate, no more in its own power, but wholly governed by the dictates of Marius and Sulpicius, alarmed at the report of Sylla's advancing with his troops towards the city, sent forth two of the praetors, Brutus and Servilius, to forbid his near approach. The soldiers would have slain these praetors in a fury, but for their bold language to Sylla, contenting themselves, however, with breaking their rods and tearing off their purple-edged robes. After much contumelious usage, they sent them back, to the sad dejection of the citizens, who beheld their magistrates despoiled of their badges of office, and announcing to them that things were now manifestly come to a rupture past all cure. Marius put himself in readiness, and Sylla with his colleague moved from Nola, at the head of 6 complete legions, all of them willing to march up directly against the city, though he himself as yet was doubtful in thought and apprehensive of the danger, as he was sacrificing. Postumius the soothsayer, having inspected the entrails, stretching forth both hands to Sylla, required to be bound and kept in custody till the battle was over, as willing if they had not speedy and complete success, to suffer the utmost punishment. It is said also that there appeared to Sylla himself in a dream a certain goddess whom the Romans learnt to worship from the Cappadocians, whether it be the moon or Pallas or Bellona. This same female entity, to his thinking, stood by him and put into his hand thunder and lightning. Then, naming his enemies one by one, bade him strike them, who, all of them, fell on the discharge and disappeared. Encouraged by this vision, and relating it to his colleague, next day he led on towards Rome. About Picina being met by a deputation beseeching him not to attack at once in the heat of a march, for that the Senate had decreed to do him all the right imaginable, he consented to halt on the spot and sent his officers to measure out the ground as is usual for a camp, so that the deputation, believing it, returned. They were no sooner gone, but he sent a party on under the command of Lucius Basilis and Caius Mummius to secure the city gate and the walls on the side of the Esquiline hill, and then close at their heels followed himself with all speed. Basilis made his way successfully into the city, but the armed multitude, pelting him with stones and tiles from off the houses, stopped his further progress and beat him back to the wall. Sylla by this time was coming up, and seeing what was going on, called aloud to his men to set fire to the houses, and, taking a flaming torch, he himself led the way, and commanded the archers to make use of their fire darts, letting fly at the tops of houses, all which he did, not upon any plan, but simply in his fury, yielding the conduct of that day's work to passion, and as if all he saw were enemies, without respect or pity, either to friends, relations, or acquaintance, made his entry by fire, which knows no distinction betwixt friend or foe. In this conflict Marius, being driven into the temple of Mother Earth, thence invited the slaves by a proclamation of freedom, but the enemy coming on, he was overpowered and fled the city. Sylla, having called a senate, had sentence of death passed on Marius, and some few others, amongst whom was Sulpicius, tribune of the people. Sulpicius was killed, being betrayed by his servant, whom Sylla first made free, and then threw him headlong down the Tarpeian rock. As for Marius, he set a price on his life by proclamation, neither gratefully nor politically, if we consider into whose house, not long before he put himself at mercy, and safely dismissed. Had Marius at that time not let Sylla go, but suffered him to be slain by the hands of Sulpicius, he might have been lord of all. Nevertheless, he spared his life, and a few days after, when in a similar position, himself received a different measure. By these proceedings, Sylla excited the secret distaste of the Senate, but the displeasure and free indignation of the commonalty showed itself plainly by their actions, for they ignominiously rejected Nonius, his nephew, and Servius, who stood for offices of state by his interest, and elected others as magistrates, by honoring whom they thought should most annoy him. yeah, don't do that with politics. At, you know, do the best in your position, not, well, it's going to be against these people. So anybody who votes against something, you know, to so the other side doesn't succeed in, what they brought up, these people should be voted out of office, but they're not. But he made semblance of extreme satisfaction at all this, as if the people by his means had again enjoyed the liberty of doing what seemed best to them, and to pacify the public hostility, he created Lucius Cinna consul, one of the adverse party, having first bound him under oaths and imprecations to be favorable to his interest. For Cinna, ascending the Capitol with a stone in his hand, swore solemnly and prayed with direful curses that he himself, if he were not true to his friendship with Sylla, might be cast out of the city as that stone out of his hand, and thereupon cast the stone to the ground in the presence of many people. Nevertheless, Cinna had no sooner entered on his charge, but he took measures to disturb the present settlement, having prepared an impeachment against Sylla. Got Verginius, one of the tribunes of the people, to be his accuser, but Sylla, leaving him and the court of judicature to themselves, set forth against Mithridates. I don't know how many more programs for Sylla, but